This is Counterpoint, and I'm your host, Tanya Granic Allen. How exactly does freedom of information work in Ontario? And why should everyday citizens care about access to government records they never see? What's the balance between protecting individuals' privacy and holding public institutions accountable for their decisions? And when the rules change, who gains transparency and who loses it? These questions have come into sharp focus as the Ontario government recently moved to update its Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, known as Fipa, the law that governs how public records are accessed and how personal information is protected in the province. Under the proposed changes, records held by the Premier, cabinet ministers, parliamentary assistants, and their political staff could be excluded from FOI requests, effectively placing these communications outside public scrutiny. Critics, including independent watchdogs, argue that this could significantly weaken transparency and accountability in government. Well, joining us today to unpack what this means for privacy, openness, and democratic oversight is David Goodis, a Canadian lawyer and recognized expert in privacy, data protection, and access to information law, who also served as Assistant Commissioner at the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario. David, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time. So,
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. So you spent years at the in the commissioner's office, and you really understand this issue and how freedom of information works and how privacy works. But a lot of ordinary citizens really have no idea about what they can access and how all of this works. Could you please explain the law and how that process of accessing information works in Ontario specifically?
Sure. Well, to start, I'll just say that the right of access for everyone in Ontario, everyone around the world, really, is very broad. It applies to not only the Ontario government and all its ministries and agencies, but also things like hospitals and universities, municipalities, police, school boards. So it's very, very broad, covering virtually the entire public sector in Ontario. And the way it works is it's meant to be quite simple. Nothing complicated. You fill out a form. You can do it online now. You pay your fee, which is a small fee of $5 or $10, and you make your request. And the government normally has 30 days to respond to your request. And you describe what records you're seeking, and they have to respond to that. And they may give you the record that you want, or they may not. And if they're holding anything back or making redactions, they have to explain that to you. And you do have a right of appeal. So if you're not receiving the information that you expected to receive, you can challenge that at the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario.
Wow. So it's open. Basically, you can request anything you like. Most cases, you'll get the information you need, but sometimes they'll say, you know what, this is too sensitive, or it's not in the jurisdiction or domain, and so then you can potentially appeal. So that's interesting. But now we have some changes being proposed. What are the changes that the Ontario Premier is proposing?
Well, the biggest, most significant change is the difference now with ministers' records, the Premier's records, ministers' records, parliamentary assistants' records, and even records of their staff. And there are many, political staff that assist these people at, the highest levels of government. So what the government is proposing here is to say all of those records that all of those people hold are now going to be outside the act. They're no longer fair game. You can't make a request. So this is really a very significant change, and it's carving out a lot of records from access, records that, as I said, these are records that are being held by very senior, government officials. And these are the people that we want to hold to account among, all other government officials. And suddenly now the records they hold are off limits. So this is going to have a very negative impact on all of our rights to access government-held information.
And just for context purposes, are there any other jurisdictions in Canada, any other provinces that have done something similar?
There are. The federal government has actually done something similar. Parliament did make an exclusion similar to the one we see in Ontario. So to be fair, it wouldn't be the first time it's ever been done. But across Canada, I believe every province does allow these records to be accessible.
Okay, I'm going to pause you
Hasn't
there.
taken this.
We have to cut to a commercial break, but we're going to pick this discussion up in just a few moments. Welcome back to Counterpoint. We're unpacking what is required and what is interesting about information and privacy access, especially in provinces like Ontario, where there's proposed legislation to change what access to information you as a citizen have. And joining me again for this discussion is David Goodis, who's a former assistant commissioner at the Information and Privacy Commission of Ontario. David, again, thank you so much for joining me. A lot of times when we hear legislation that has caused much division or a lot of debate, we ask the question, why? Why was this legislation proposed, or why is it being proposed? And some critics have some sharp commentary, but what are some of the reasons, or what do you feel is the reason that this legislation has come to be?
Yeah, it's hard for us to know. These decisions are made, behind closed doors, at the cabinet level, because this is a proposal, to introduce legislation to make this change. So we don't know for sure. There have been some recent controversies, sort of legal controversies, I guess I would say, around the scope of Fipa. And in particular, there was a case involving the Premier's personal cell phone, and were records derived from that cell phone of discussions that were made in the course of official business. Are those records accessible? And there was a decision by the IPC that they were, and that was, I believe, upheld in court. I think this caused some concern, some anxiety around, what really is the appropriate scope of minister-held records and access to those. So I don't know, but this could be a factor that was driving the government to take a harder look at the scope of Fipa, and maybe we need to make some changes to that.
Yeah, and timing is interesting, and some of our viewers may be familiar with the case in which I guess there's a demand for the Premier's cell phone records. Timing is kind of interesting. We shall see. That could perhaps be a motivation. But beyond just the Premier, when we're talking about top politicians and political staffers, there's another thing. Like, these are folks who are employed on the public dime. There is an understanding or an assumption, I would assume, that anything you do on the public dime, in the public business, that is in the public domain. I mean, I was a political staffer once. I get it. I assumed anything I did physically in this office, on any office computer or anything, could be accessed through a Freedom of Information request. So what kind of impact would we see if we're now excluding top officials from FOI requests?
Well, you may see an impact in the sense of there being a greater kind of black hole or a blind spot in terms of what we can understand about how decisions are made at the highest level, how they're made, who is involved in discussions, these kinds of things. And so, long term, that can have, I think, a great impact because we want to hold our politicians to account. Mm-hmm. Especially those at the highest level.
Yeah, and like, I know some of our users might say, okay, well, that's Premier Ford's cell phone, like that's his personal phone, that should be off limits. What sort of other things would we see excluded by this type of legislation? Would it be like personal emails loaded onto government devices? What other things would be within the scope?
Think of it this way. So the way the law is right now, if I'm a minister, I can say, look, I hold a lot of different kinds of records in this office. The records that reveal confidential cabinet discussions, those are exempt. I don't have to disclose those. Mm-hmm. And that's fair and appropriate. And that's consistent with the laws across Canada. But for me as a cabinet minister to say, everything I hold here, all of my records that I hold in my capacity as a minister, they're off limits. There can be all kinds of different records. I can't, it would be hard to list all the possibilities, but there could be all kinds of records, emails, memos, various communications, communications on electronic devices. All of those would be off limits. And you don't have to show that they're going to reveal confidential cabinet discussions. You can just say, I hold them, therefore they're off limits.
Right, right. So there is a balance, which I think is appropriate. I mean, we always hear about redactions and things like this, and that seems reasonable and fair. Um, is the opposition, which is now the NDP in Ontario, are they on board with this?
No, from my understanding, just keeping an eye on media reports, my understanding is the opposition NDP is strongly opposed to the changes,
Right.
which I've seen from the interviews of the leader. So no, there is strong opposition from the politicians, from the opposition party, and of course from others, as you described.
Okay, we're going to pick up this discussion in just a few moments when we return. Welcome back to Counterpoint. I'm joined by David Goodis, who's a former Assistant Commissioner at the Information and Privacy Commission of Ontario, as we discuss new changes being proposed to privacy and access to information laws here in Ontario that will impact government and maybe the access of information that you feel that you have a right to. Do you even have a right to it? Well, we're going to find all that information out on the show. David, again, thank you so much for joining us today. So when people hear that a government wants to clamp down on access to information that they may have or privacy, some people get their backs up and they say, well, this makes me trust the government even less. And we know there are, polls and statistics that keep track of public trust in institutions. Where do things sit now? And does legislation like this aid or abet or hinder trust in government?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think you're right, and that's my understanding. From some of the research that I've done, is that trust in government is at an all-time low, and I think that's in many countries across the world, but absolutely in Canada. And there, in my mind, there is no question that when you propose a change to freedom of information legislation that restricts or narrows access to government records, all you're doing is feeding into the cynicism, the mistrust that people have, ordinary citizens have in their government. The message being sent is, we can already withhold information from the public. We've got a number of exemptions where we can withhold information. You hear about, a reporter makes a request and the records are heavily redacted, that kind of thing. Which, there has to be a balance, right? Not
Right.
everything can be disclosed. But when the government says, well, we're going to now change the law, we're going to amend it, we're going to narrow it or restrict access to records at the highest level of government, I will emphasize, then again, you're feeding into that cynicism, that mistrust. And, I think we all pay a price as trust in government gets lower and lower. Our institutions are weakened. Our democracy is weakened. I think we all pay a price for that. So this is absolutely the wrong message to send at this time when trust in government, needs to be fixed. It needs to be increased rather than decreased. This is a move that really takes us in the wrong direction.
And look, I'm not looking to only like flog Doug Ford and Premier Doug Ford for this. I mean, we see on the federal level with legislation like Bill C-22. On the converse, when government's sort of clawing back and saying, less information for you, and we're going to restructure this. But for us, we want more of your information, and we want unbridled access to it. So again, feeding into this machine of, I don't know if I want to trust you anymore because you're giving me less and wanting more from me.
Exactly. And, that I agree. That's part of the erosion of public trust is cynicism around, well, the government can surveil me. And here in Canada, at the federal level, the government is giving themselves greater powers to surveil me as an individual, and all Canadians essentially. That's another way that public trust is decreased. Because as you say, it's like the government saying to the people that we're going to hold our cards even tighter. You're going to see less of what we have, and you're going to learn less about how we operate. Oh, and by the way, we're going to be surveilling you more. We're going to learn more about you, your habits and maybe your communications, albeit in not an unlimited way, with limits on it. But they're taking steps to increase and enable access to individuals' personal information, increase the potential for surveillance. So those are two very bad messages again from governments, federal, provincial, that again all they do is decrease trust in government, and that's a big problem. So they're concerning on both levels. That it's sort of interesting. It's sort of the bi-directional, information
Right.
flowing from the government to us and from us to the government. Uh, we're going backwards in both ways.
And what are the risks when we do that? Like, I know we've kind of danced around it, but why should the public be concerned?
Well, privacy is a democratic value. We all have a right to privacy. It's enshrined in the charter, and we have to achieve the right balance. And I think the people have a say in that. What is the right balance between protecting our privacy, yet enabling government to do its job, to ensure public safety, all of that. But we currently have a balance. It may not be perfect, but then pushing the balance towards more surveillance
Right.
is there's a cost to that. There's a cost to that
Okay, I'm going to pause you
of
there.
control.
We've got to cut to commercial, but we're going to be right back at Counterpoint in just a moment. Welcome back to Counterpoint. We're discussing freedom, information, privacy, and all that comes under that umbrella. As you, as a citizen, you may want to access records. What is the government doing? What are they doing with my money, whether provincially, federally? Well, laws being proposed in Ontario might change how much access you actually will have. And joining me for this discussion is David Goodis. David, we were, having a really interesting discussion just before commercial break about that balance. And it really is a balance because on one hand, yes, this is, I'm funding this whole operation, this government. I'd like to know what they're doing with my money and my time. But on the other hand, I do trust the government to enact on my behalf. And some things, like very confidential cabinet meetings, et cetera, they have to remain confidential. So I also appreciate that. How how does one determine how to make that balance? I mean, if think of it like a seesaw, if you're on one side, you will really be heavy on one side. It could almost seem like a dictatorship or something that harkens in a communist regime.
Yes, and the balance, we can debate the balance, and there are always ongoing debates about that. But if your laws are kind of in line with other laws across Canada and even around the world, in democracies around the world, that suggests strongly that we have a good balance. So if you're going to upset that balance and you're going to push towards uh, more secrecy, you better have a good reason for that. There really needs to be evidence, and this is why I'm concerned. I'm not seeing the evidence that there is a significant concern around. Oh, there's been too much disclosure. This greater disclosure has interfered with confidential cabinet discussions. We can't have proper discussions because too much information is out there. Where is the evidence of that? If there were evidence of that, fine. But we're not seeing it. The government's not sharing that with us. So it's hard to support this kind of change.
So one approach I have seen come out, and you can maybe provide some examples if you have, is there seemed to be an advocacy for kind of stronger public disclosure, that rather than waiting for the public to request this information, that the governments themselves are more forthcoming with information and are more upfront. Where have you seen that, and is that a good approach to take?
It's a very good approach, and lots of governments around the world, to be fair, including in Canada, including in many provinces, have taken quite good steps to actively disclose information. So you're seeing more and more, on websites that ministries, agencies are posting information that they say, well, this can be public. There's no harm in posting this
Mm,
information, or maybe they post it just with a name removed, and they're being more transparent. And that's really the way it should work. FOI works better when records that should be public, where there's no concern around harm, should be made available freely and easily. We're in an era with electronic, platforms, online platforms, that is very, very easy to do that. And very, very slowly, governments are moving in that direction, but there's a lot more that could be done.
So if like this whole tranche of communications, a lot of government communications are now moved outside of the FOI, the Freedom of Information process. Um, what other mechanisms, if any, are there to access the information or to hold actually governments to account?
Yeah, it's difficult, and this is the problem. How do you hold governments to account when you don't even understand what's happened? You don't understand the facts surrounding, say, a
Right.
certain controversy or project the government has, or a proposal, or spending on a certain project, something like that. When you don't have the information, you can't hold the government to account. You're blind. You have to start. Well, it's implied that something bad has happened here, but I don't know. And people have to be careful. Media has to be careful not to suggest, oh well, there's a suggestion of wrongdoing. Well, how do you know? You can't make that allegation. You need support. It's possible, like in some cases, to get the courts to require disclosure, but that's going to be very, very difficult and extremely rare.
Yeah, and of course, we're going to have to keep our eye on this to see how this legislation develops. While conversely, I'm going to be doing another show on this actually on C22. But very interesting times indeed. Thank you so much, David. I appreciate all of your insights today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to suggest a topic for the show, feel free to reach out via X at Granic Allen or via the News Forum website. Thanks for watching. This has been Counterpoint.